Hey everyone. Hey, how many of you were here yesterday? Was that not awesome? Ben Jaffe and Walter Rising, that was great. Beyond that, welcome to International Jazz Day. Welcome to the New Orleans Jazz Museum. We're psyched to be here. Thank you to Meyer Sound for helping. And today in particular, I think we'll see how essential they are to all of this. And thank them very much for being here. Most importantly, I want to thank Mr. Jon Cleary.
Thank you.
Can you see me?
I want to get into. I wish I were taller, John. But
that goes good.
I can't. Okay. So let's think of it this way. What we're going to do is sort of walk through Jon's career and the like. I'm sure most of you know who he is, if not all of you. But think about this. You're 18 years old. You're a guitar player. You're somewhere near Kent, England, and you decide you'd like to come to New Orleans, check things out. And you find your way to the Maple Leaf Bar, and you get a job painting the darn thing on the outside. Meanwhile, James Booker has his residency while you're there working, and you get to watch him do what he does. And then one day, you know, he's amazing but erratic. He doesn't show up, Mr. Booker, not Mr. Cleary, and lo and behold, Jon Cleary takes the stage, and the rest, I guess, is history. Jon Cleary over the years has played with some extraordinary players as well as leading his own band, including Bonnie Raitt, John Scofield, in an amazing project that I really very much enjoyed, Eric Clapton, B.B. King, a lot of other notables. But today we're going to hear a little bit about Jon and some of the essential New Orleans piano players. Why don't we start? Can you go all the way back to when? Just talk about coming over here as a young man and what that at the Maple Leaf and what that experience was like, and then maybe work your way towards James Booker.
Sure. That's a very nice introduction. Thank you. One thing was actually factually incorrect.
Uh-oh.
My first job wasn't painting the Maple Leaf Bar. I was digging up the banana trees in the back.
Duly noted, for the record.
Set of skills required for that job. And I actually also laid, if any of you go to the Maple Leaf, those really crooked bricks where someone's going to trip over and break their necks. I did those too. I laid the bricks 38 years ago.
Lawsuit pending. We'll see how that.
Yes. That's my real job, actually. I've just ended up being a piano player by accident temporarily. One of these days I'm going to get back to the bricklaying. So this is just a stepping aside, doing something a bit different for 40 years.
So you want to talk a little bit about James Booker, a celebrated player that I think a lot of people really didn't come to his music until after he passed away, other than people who happen to live in New Orleans.
Well, I knew his name. I mean, it was hard to get records in England, but you got whatever information you could, and I knew that James Booker was a piano player. And the night I arrived I don't know if they even still have it, but to the right of the door would be a little piece of wood with slots, and they'd put in a piece of paper that everybody who was playing, 7 slots for each day of the week, and Tuesdays was James Booker. And I spotted that when I walked in the bar. But that bar at that time was full of eccentric characters, and it was a repository of all the round pegs that didn't fit in square holes. And to that extent, Booker was just another one of the colourful characters. He was completely bonkers, totally out to lunch, and so in the context of the Maple Leaf Bar, he seemed completely normal. So it's kind of with hindsight, all these years later, and he's been dead and gone since 1985, I think he died. His recordings and the various obscure live sets that have appeared and been put on CD, lots has been written about him, and they made films about him, and he's kind of if you like New Orleans music, then you know who James Booker is. But that wasn't the case then. So he would play every Tuesday night, and they'd put out a few chairs, and it might be like 16 people in the place to hear Booker. And the guy that still is one of the co-owners of the bar was managing him at the time. And Booker was kind of unmanageable. And I know lots, when you talk about Booker, generally people have all the sort of the anecdotes about how mad he was and all that sort of stuff. So there's lots of those stories. But he would, the manager had an apartment upstairs. If you look at the Maple Leaf from the street, at that time, on the right, there were two apartments up on the balcony. The right one was where the manager lived, and he had a room in the back where Booker used to stay if he didn't have anywhere else to stay. So quite often he'd be staying upstairs from the Maple Leaf. Downstairs at the Maple Leaf in the back was a laundromat, and upstairs in the other part was a gun shop. So the Maple Leaf was a combination laundromat, gun shop, and music joint. And that's where James Booker lived, basically, upstairs in the back room. And so yeah, he was just one of the characters in a bar full of extraordinary individuals. But because he spent a lot of time staying upstairs, he would often just hang out in the bar in the daytime if he didn't have anywhere to be particularly. And he would get free drinks, so that was a no-brainer. So he'd be there. Quite often Roosevelt Sykes would hang out as well. And there used to be the piano used to be against the wall. So if I'd be outside with a paintbrush painting, the musical accompaniment would be a couple of hours of James Booker giving me a private concert, basically, or Roosevelt Sykes playing the blues. You know.
When he was by himself, like, was he all sort of flourishes? I mean, was he basically as flashy playing for himself as he would be in front of an audience?
Yeah, he played pretty much the same stuff. I think quite often he always played to the audience, but I don't think the audience made any difference on which notes he selected or how much of that kind of detail and I always think of the little New Orleans flourishes on the piano as being like all the detail on those balconies on Royal Street, all the filigree ironwork is all that, all those little fills, they sound like that. So he'd always do a lot of that kind of stuff.
So when you came over, in terms of your facility on the piano, what could you do yourself?
I was pretty useless. I mean, I was a guitar player. I didn't even play piano. I was a guitar player. I played guitar since I was old enough to try and get my hand around my dad's guitar and pick out notes and stuff. So I was a guitar player, but we had a piano at home. I had my grandma's old piano. So I'd always kind of fooled around with little kind of boogie-woogie stuff. And the first thing I tried to learn on the piano was, or two of the first things I tried to learn were Tipatina and Big Chief. And Big Chief is by Professor Long. Tipitina's a Professor Longhair tune. Big Chief is a Fess tune. And it goes by so quickly, it's really hard to hear it. And when I used to go up and stay with my grandmother, my various aunts and uncles, there were like bits of their record collections all still left at my grandma's house. So when I went up there, my Uncle John had left a bunch of New Orleans records, and there was a good bunch of funk records there that my auntie was digging and all that kind of stuff. So he had lived in New Orleans, and he had a good New Orleans record collection, 45s he bought at Jim Russell's record shop on Magazine Street. I'm talking about 50 years ago. 56 years ago, something like that. But he had Big Chief on 45. You could, like I say, you can get these records in England, so it was great. But when I went up and stayed with him, I'd have to play it over and over and over again and try and memorize it so that when I got home, I'd know what to play, because it might be like 2 or 3 months before I could actually hear that record again. You didn't have YouTube. You just type in any record, it just comes up. This is like one piece of plastic that existed in the southeast of England. It had this on it. So I had to listen to that over and over and try and memorize it and figure it out. And then when I got home, back to when we would go home to the countryside, I'd sit at the piano and try and remember it. So those were the two things. So anyway, so I had a couple of little chops, but not too much really. So I could probably play about 4 or 5 tunes all the way through, and they seemed to dig it. The night I had to get up and play, they seemed to dig it, and I played played my songs and I played them all over again.
Well, in terms of your progression, you want to just show something like one of those early things that you could play?
Well, I taught myself to play piano pretty much. I'd had instructions from members of my family on how to play guitar, and it was a matter of sitting there with the guitar and picking out a chord and then finding so that's G, this is C, and just figuring it all out from there. So I just started off with transposing guitar chords on the piano, but I always I was listening to New Orleans piano, so it's kind of funny when I play piano. It's a very strong default New Orleans accent, if you like, even though I don't have an American accent particularly. But when I play piano, it's got a really strong New Orleans accent. And if you want to be a session player, you have to be able to ditch that if the song doesn't require it. You know, but most of the time I get hired to play New Orleans piano anyway. But being a session musician, you've got to be able to know all the other stuff too and be able to leave that flavor out if it's not appropriate. But most of the time, if I sit down to play, it's influenced by that stuff I used to hear Booker play through the window. And at that time, really, the piano players on record you could hear were Dr. John, Mac Rebennack, and Alan Toussaint. Booker wasn't even really on the radar. But for me, being living in New Orleans at that time, Booker was the one cat I actually had access to on a fairly regular basis. And I never actually asked him for any lessons or anything. But he was around so much that that's kind of the right way to learn music. I think you kind of you soak in, you take a bath in the deep end of it, and enough of it permeates the pores of your skin and kind of gets in there.
Seems very daunting to me.
Yeah.
Particularly Booker.
Yeah. But Booker and Mac and Alan Toussaint, you know, a lot of that stuff is very sophisticated. A lot of it's pretty simple. So you just find there's really, really easy stuff, and that's how you get started. You know. So like the riff, you know. I used to, when I started, I had to play it with two hands. And then you finally figure out, well, if I move, you know, so you just figure it out bit by bit. I'm still trying to, in about 60 or 70 years' time, come back, we'll do this again, and I'll have this shit down. But right now, I'm still trying to figure it out. But you want to talk a little bit about what makes it what it is?
I was thinking that the accent, however you want to take.
All right, cool. So how many of y'all are musicians? How many of you are not musicians? So forgive me, musicians, if I'm talking about stuff you already know. But this is for the bulk of people who don't actually play music. Who, you know, someone said if I could have a wish, what would it be? And it would be just for 5 or 10 minutes to have the ears of someone that can't play music, and then hear a good piece of music, and just to experience what that feels like. Because when you start playing music and start figuring it out, it's a curse. It's a bit like if someone gives you a puzzle. If you get a jigsaw puzzle, and not that I do jigsaw puzzles particularly, but any kind of puzzle, once you've done it, then, well, I've done that one. Give me another one. And it's like that with music, really. If you're constantly solving puzzles, and the sad thing is that in the process of doing so, some of the mystery is lost. And so it's like a narcotic, then you have to go after the next one that's got a bit more to give up, you know, a bit more challenging. But sometimes people have asked me in the past what makes New Orleans piano playing quintessentially New Orleans, or what's really going on to make it, give it those qualities. And you can break it down into two things, essentially: rhythm, the percussion of the music, and harmony. And any aspect of music can be looked at through those two terms. They're two different things, that are two tools that are used together. And you can really go into great depth in trying to explain this, but I'll try and keep it simple so it doesn't end up sounding like a music lecture, doesn't get boring. So in real basic terms, for non-musicians, when you have a chord, you're talking about a collection of notes, any number of notes. But a chord in its most basic form is 3 notes And the one I first played on the piano was this one, C. And that's called a C. Its full title is C major. If C minor requires that you change one note. And this chord is full of mystery because it's universally acknowledged as being a melancholy sound. And nobody to this day has ever been able to answer the question as to why that is. And they've even done this experiment with remote tribes in the Amazon and who've never really heard Western music. And everyone agrees that C major is one thing, and C minor has a sad, melancholy quality. So in terms of the harmony, what they did in New Orleans and some other places too, but arguably more and better in New Orleans, was this brilliant idea of, well, why don't we mix the two up? And no one ever sat around the table and had a committee meeting saying, I've got a great idea. It's just kind of like a Darwinian process. These things evolve, and if someone likes them, then you do them again. If no one digs it, then you don't put it out on the next gig. But if you play a minor and a major chord together, you get this. And everybody, whether they're a musician or non-musician, would be in universal agreement that pretty much sound, if you said, does that sound in tune or out of tune? You'd have to have something, have to be pretty unmusical to say that's in tune. But that actually would be the wrong answer. Because what is in tune, what is out of tune? Well, what's been considered in and out of tune is something that's been in a state of flux for millennia. It was the ancient Greeks that first plucked a piece of string tied between two posts, which is what this is in the piano, and plucked it and watched what happened. And they did the same thing. They had two water jugs with different amounts of water, and when they hit them, they gave out different notes. And you could adjust the pitch. You could adjust the pitch by tightening the string. You could adjust the pitch by shortening the string. And what they observed led to the invention of the modern major scale. We got a major chord, we got a minor chord, you put them together, and it does that, and we all agree that sounds out of tune. But if you rearrange these notes, you can find in certain combinations, you can get some interesting effects. And essentially it's like mixing sugar and crystal hot sauce. I mean, technically they just don't work. But I'll give you a couple of quick examples. So here are those same notes separated by an octave. Pretty painful to the ear. But if I add 3 more notes to it, watch what happens. So we've got these 2 notes here. I'm going to add these ones. And I go this and that. And now we got... That's the funk chord right there. And that chord, a bit is in a similar way to the respect in which a minor chord has, it's evocative. This is evocative. This is the chord it's the James Brown chord. It's a modern chord. In previous centuries, if you'd played that, it was actually considered devil's music, and you would have been in serious trouble in the days of the Spanish Inquisition. You got caught you playing a C7 raised 9 chord. You'd probably be straight to the torture room. But that chord is dirty, it's sexy, it's nasty. And you think when you hear those 2 notes in isolation, here they are in isolation, here they are with the other notes added. It's nasty. But if I change the notes that go with it, you can go from the nastiest chord to the sweetest chord. So now I've got the same 2 notes, and now I'm going to add this note, this note, this note, and this note. And now it's instant Carpenters. Here's the other one. Anyway, point is, then if you spend some time on it, and I've spent about 56 years on it, or 50 years rather, trying to figure it out, you can play with those two elements. And in the terms of James Booker and the piano players, you can get this stuff that sounds like this. You slur from one to the other, you get. So you can get a very evocative sound. So that's one aspect of New Orleans piano, is using what musicians call blue notes. And that was just one of them. You got this one. And then you have... Every time you're pulling these things out, you're painting a picture, and then you can change... textures as you go along. So it's playing with major to minor. And in the blues, and you know, in that device in the hands of most musicians, most singers, is simply a matter of singing the minor note, the sad one, and then gradually tailing it up and rising up to that note. Do 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 do. So you bend it. So a clarinet or a saxophone or a guitar string or a trumpet, all those instruments can bend those notes. A piano, you can't bend the notes. So you have to emulate that. And so you do this. So you hit the sad note at the beginning, let it trail off, and so just the happy notes left. And really in one note, you've done what people do over the course of an entire movie or a novel or whatever. You get the happy ending, you create dissonance. And then you have a resolution, which is nice. So you're creating consonance from dissonance. You're creating order out of chaos. You're doing everything that people, you don't have to understand what's underneath the hood to get that when you hear it. It makes you feel good. And so you hear that buried through all the piano playing. Like. Anyway, so that's a little glimpse into one aspect of the tools you're working with in respect to harmony. And then the other thing about New Orleans is that the drums have always been a part of the music here. New Orleans music is a combination of an African approach to music and a European approach to music, all muddled up. But you know, New Orleans has always been funky. Everything about New Orleans is funky. And if you ask me to define funk in terms of what's going on in the percussion department, I would say it's basically taking 4 beats of a bar and breaking them into small fractions and then putting heavy emphasis on the odd fractions such that you get kind of thrown off a little bit, but then you get righted again. And it's the same, really, what's going on with the world of harmonies, upsetting something and then writing it. So, for example, because if you play just... I mean, that's never going to get funky. Forget it. But if you want to go like this... that's Tipatina, or a version of a variety on Tipatina. So yeah, those two things going, and that kind of is one way of describing the two or three of the things that kind of underpin New Orleans piano playing.
I thought at the end we're going to have questions, but maybe this is a good point now, in our lecture. Does anyone have a question based on what you've just heard that's stuck in your craw and you want to? Yeah.
My question was, when you were painting and laying the brick, what year was that about?
That was 1981, I think.
And
Yeah.
my second question is about talking about the funk, and I was trying to explain that to someone yesterday. And when you talk about Fess and all these people who came, did they study piano, or did it just come naturally, or did it just flow? What happened? How did they get it?
Well, I think they did study, but not in a formal sense. I think if you're talking about Professor Longhair and Toots Washington and Alan Toussaint and Huey Piansmith, James Booker, Edward Frank, Mac Rebennack, I think there's so much music here in town in New Orleans that if you have a musical disposition, if you have the kind of brain that can process musical information, which not everybody does, and everyone has it to varying degrees, but if you have a good musical brain to start with and you grow up in New Orleans, it would be very hard to imagine you not getting hold of an instrument and becoming a musician, even if you don't necessarily choose to go and do it for a living. But you don't think for this stuff, they didn't teach it in school, and there are exceptions, but generally speaking, in my experience, I've had people that come to me for piano lessons, and I don't really like to give piano lessons. I had 2 piano lessons when I was at school, and I was useless. But people sometimes come to me and they want to learn how to play New Orleans piano, and it's often, but if someone's classically trained, then it's almost impossible. Just because the fingering, because I never was shown proper fingering, but my fingering's all wrong. But I've watched Fess and and Mac, and their fingering's all wrong as well. That's how you make that sound. That's why it sounds cool. I mean, Toussaint was a bit cleaner. He actually did have formal training. And I don't think his piano playing got quite as greasy as Fess's or Mac's. And Booker was unusual because he had classical, he could do both. And they're usually mutually exclusive. So they studied. I mean, I'm sure Fess sat there and played the piano for hours and hours when he was a kid, driving everybody nuts probably. But yeah, they were really good. You don't get that way without doing lots of practice and studying. But you don't go to Professor Longhair School or anything like that.
Hey, going all the way back to like Jelly Roll Morton, can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about him and what he sort of contributed and where we hear him today?
Well, I'm probably, of all the piano players in town, I'm probably one of the least qualified to offer up any pearls of wisdom about Jelly Roll Morton. But he is interesting. Well, interesting for many, many reasons, but the part of his book of his repertoire that interests me is what he called the Spanish tinge. And that goes back a little bit to the example I gave you just then of Tipatina, that had the little Montuno motif on the end. The Spanish tinge, as far as he was referencing it, I think, was once again as a reference to rhythm and harmony. But in respect to rhythm, it was really this groove here. That's it in its very basic form. That pulse is something we've all heard a million times. But if you go back 200 years, it was an incredibly new thing, given the context of classical music and what was available. That sounded exotic, funky, sexy, dangerous, dark, mysterious, and that groove is one you associate with every Caribbean island, including New Orleans, has that thing in it. Cuba was the biggest cultural sort of center of gravity in this part of the world. In Cuba, you have the Habanera, and that's what that rhythm is. And the Habanera was popular at the end of the 18th century, the 19th century, and it was a dance craze that swept all the way through the Caribbean, even went back to Europe. And Bizet used that rhythm in Carmen, the opera Carmen. It was the most talked about, or best known example of Cuban habanera rhythms making their way back to Spain and the European mainstream. But that rhythm, here in New Orleans, they call that paquiway, or street beat. And that's the rhythm you hear of the Mardi Gras Indians. It's so much an essential building block of the music from this part of the world. You find it in Cuba, you find it in Jamaica, you find it in New Orleans, you find it in the music of Haiti, all across the French Antilles, Martinique, Guadeloupe. And there it is. And it's the same thing for what we call rumba here in New Orleans. So Professor Longhair thing. But there it is again. And the habanera was a craze. And the question is whether the habanera was invented in Cuba and was brought to New Orleans. Like New Orleans got it second. Where there's another school of thought, which I think is more likely, is that it happened at the same time in New Orleans because it's the same people, basically, as in Cuba. At least that time in history. But there's, it's lovely. It's quite dainty. It's quite sophisticated. It's quite pretty. It's quite sexy if you handle it in the right way. And it still works today. And you find in Cuba that there are you get lots of opportunities to hear people playing music from a habanero, or as it became known, danzón. And eventually morphed into what people nowadays call salsa, even though salsa is a word that was invented by a record company in New York. Cuban son features this in the bass part. It's called a montuno, so if that's where the time is, you get the syncopated bass line. And you kind of find that in New Orleans too, in the what they call the big four, which 1, 2, 3, 4, bam! When you get the big bass drum in the marching bands in New Orleans jazz, you have a similar emphasis on the odd beats on the bottom end, kick drum and the bass. That's a link. So Jelly Roll Morton was one of the first people who embodied all of that stuff, and it was naturally New Orleans, but it was also from Cuba, and he called it the Spanish tinge. And there's an old tune which predates Jelly Roll Morton that I discovered recently that was written by, there's an interesting story behind it, because it was written by a young man who was a slave. He was actually enslaved working for a guy that owned a music store on Royal Street. And he started writing music, and his music was so good and so popular that whilst it was published, and he was getting royalty checks while still a slave. And his name was a phrase from New Orleans called Basile Barres. And there's this lovely old tune. He goes, have that. Then you go a few years later and you have. Jelly Roll Morton playing Habanera. And you go up to 1976 and you got Art Never going. But that's the same groove. So that's really where Jelly Roll Morton was one of the first kind of funk players coming up with that shit.
By the way, parenthetically, maybe picking up from yesterday's talk, if you haven't seen it, the film A Tuba to Cuba with Prez Hall illustrates some of this. It's a wonderful, wonderful film. In terms of your path, you went back at some point to England, and then was it there that you connected or began playing with, Dr. John maybe to the rest of us, but Mac? How did that talk a little bit about that? And
when I came here as a kid, I just left school and I just wanted to come to New Orleans. So I came here for a 2-week holiday and never left. And then eventually I had to leave because of my visa regulations. My visa ran out, so I had to leave the country. So I spent 2 years just listening, really. I mean, I do a lot of shedding, but it was more as like a sponge, just kind of trying to soak it all up. And there weren't any books about it. There was one book called Walking to New Orleans, which was a history of New Orleans rhythm and blues, and written by an English cat who came over in the 70s, and he's like the world's leading authority on New Orleans rhythm and blues. And he actually came here in the late 60s and early 70s and found all the old cats and sat down with them, asked them all the right questions, and compiled it into a book. So I learned a lot of stuff from that, and I went to as many gigs as I could, and I spent 2 years just listening and learning. And then I had to leave the country, and when I went back to England for 2 years, that's when I started hustling gigs. But it was hard finding musicians in England that could play New Orleans stuff right. They had some good players in England, but in England you tend to get everything. You know, you get someone who's listening to Chicago blues and modern jazz and something else. And so it's when they play, it's all kind of mixed up. That time in New Orleans, you could play here with old musicians who didn't really do anything other than play New Orleans stuff. That's all they kind of dug and all they were really interested in. So you had this pure thing here, and you had an approximation of it. And so I did that for 2 years and wanted to come back to the pure thing, so I came back. But I did end up getting a gig playing guitar with Dr. John when I was over there.
Can you talk about that? How'd that come about?
Mac Rebennack came over. He hadn't been there for years. And suddenly one day in the paper it said he was coming over and playing at the Half Moon in Putney. And the band that was opening up were friends of mine. And so I was able to get in, and I got up to play a song as part of the opening act. Anyway, he needed a guitar player at some point, and I got the call. And he had moved in with the bass player, who shared a pharmaceutical interest with him. And so that's where we did the rehearsal, and there was no piano. So we were playing that night, and I knew all this stuff anyway. I loved Dr. John's stuff, but I'd never met him or anything. So we had a rehearsal, and we just passed the guitar backwards and forwards, and I heard him play some of the most exquisite guitar stuff. I've since reminded him of it, and he can't even remember it. There's one thing he wrote that I loved, and I did an approximation on the piano. So the whole thing as an introduction before he gets to that. Because I said, yeah. He said, so I'm going to, give me the guitar. And he played the whole thing on guitar. And that's hard to play, right? It's in E flat. It's modulating. And you have these complicated. But he played the whole thing on the guitar. And it was beautiful. So it blew my mind. And then on the sound check, there was a piano there, and so we switched. So I played piano, and he played, and he dug that because he likes playing guitar. So on the gig, I ended up playing some piano, and he ended up playing some guitar. But most of the time, I was playing guitar and looking right over his shoulder, trying to figure out how on earth he played all those big tenths. In the left hand on the piano is an interval, if you can stretch it, if you can reach it, which is called a tenth, which is very pleasing to the ear. The way a piano is set up, this interval, by mathematical necessity, the way pianos are tuned now is a bit out of tune. And if you listen to it, some of you might be able to hear how it's out of tune. It's very tiny, it's a tiny difference. It's kind of harsh. That's a third. But if you separate those two notes by an octave, you end up with going from this to this. That's called a tenth. And you have to, some tenths are bigger than others. If I really stretch my hand, I can make that tenth. Some of the others, because of the way the keys are laid out, require that your hands come to about here. So you have to kind of get around it. James Booker had a span that went to about here, so for him it was just easy. But when I do it, it hurts. But it sounds good, so it's worth it. But you can get this nice, That's the thing that Booker and Mac used to do. So that's the 10th. And I've just completely forgotten what I was talking about before I got into the 10th. I started to enjoy that.
Well, just Dr. Jon, can you talk about more broadly maybe his contribution to the canon? Yeah.
I think Dr. Jon's one of the most underrated piano players that comes out of New Orleans. I know, but it sounds weird because everyone's always saying what a great piano player is. But I think, personally, I think he's got such an effusive and charismatic personality combined with the whole Dr. Jon character, which was an invention that he came up with. That is so larger than life that his brilliant piano playing almost kind of fades into the background a little bit. But I think him and Booker really were the two main cats, and they kind of came up together. And I think perhaps one of the reasons Mac plays quietly is because it's easier to make those tenths. His hands are the same size as mine, but I don't know how he does it. He gets around the tenths, these intervals here, so gracefully. Whereas when I do it, I'm always fucking it up. I'm always like, my fingers slip, I'm really good at covering up my mistakes, so no one notices. But when he does it, even low down, it's very accurate and a very big reach. So he plays quite quietly. Booker, that reach was really easy for him, and I think he was a bit more strident and could be a bit more noisy. I'm pretty noisy when I play, but Booker could really dig in. Mac generally played pretty softly, and it was that stuff that that's the stuff I loved that he kind of did. So when I play, I'm just imitating him and Booker and all those guys. That's what they all did. That's how you learn,
In terms of unheralded piano players from New Orleans, is there someone that you would point to that people might not know that much about that was an influence to you, or you listen to these days and you're like, wow?
There was one cat There was probably several, but there's one cat in particular that doesn't really get mentioned very much. He was really great. And I used to go and see him play a lot. And his name was Ed Frank. He was the one-handed piano player from New Orleans, Edward Frank. And he lost the use of his left arm in a stroke, but carried on playing. So he would play a lot of, Earl King told me, and a lot of other people said he played more piano with one hand than most cats play with two. And there were a couple of occasions where I had an opportunity to sit down and play with him. So I would play the left hand stuff, and he would play the right hand stuff, and he patted me on the back and said, "Oh God," he said, "it feels so good to hear that. I can hear it in my head, I just can't play it because my arm doesn't work, you know." So I'd be or, you know. So he was a killer piano player. And he played on some of, you'll hear him without realizing it's him on some of the Fats Domino records. That's him playing piano.
Speaking of, by the way, so I'm Dean, the editor of Relix. We have our New Orleans issue that's out. In fact, I interviewed Jon in the issue, which makes me think you were talking about Fats Domino and how towards the end of his life you'd go over there and just play for him, just because he wanted to. Is that fair to say?
I was lucky enough to get invited to go over and visit him, and the piano was there, so I'd usually just make a beeline. At parties, I usually make a beeline straight for the piano, because I can't really think of anything interesting to say to anybody, so I just go and play the piano instead. And Fats at that time had been suffering from a form of dementia, I think, for a while. And so in a world that I guess that was getting increasingly foggy, the one thing that cut right through the fog was the music. And I think he really dug hearing that was something he could fully wrap his head around. And so it would be lovely play, and he would just come over by the piano and end up sitting down, and then eventually, after, without coaxing or anything, but just a bit of gentle encouragement, he'd start playing. This was the time when he pretty much didn't play anymore, I don't think. He might have played for personal pleasure, but he would play, and he was killing. He was really good. But so that's nice. Music is very good for you if you do it right.
Can you talk a little bit in terms of his style? Can you just show a little bit of what he did?
Well, he wasn't a virtuoso like Booker or Mac Rebennack. I know he didn't write songs that had complicated chord structures like Alan Toussaint did. He didn't really have the eccentric, unique inventions that Professor Longhair gave us. But he was a good rhythm player. And New Orleans rhythm and blues at that time, unlike jazz, a lot of New Orleans rhythm and blues stuff of the 50s era was pretty simple harmonically. It was like 3 chords. New Orleans jazz has always been quite rich, sophisticated harmonically. But Fats Domino came up at a time when there was a particular groove that was getting established here, which New Orleans ended up claiming as its own. And Fats is always associated with Fats Domino. And that's basically triplets in the right hand. It's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So. And the left hand is an old blues left hand that's often associated, it's a pattern that's often associated with an old blues pianist called Jimmy Yancey. But it's one you find in an old tune called Junkers Blues in New Orleans. And it's the kind of thing that anyone who could just play a little bit of piano, a little bit of blues, could get their head around pretty easily. So it's quite a common riff. But in the studio, when they cut Fats Domino and Smiley Lewis records, they had Dave Bartholomew would get the whole band playing that riff in the left hand. All the saxophones, the guitar, the drums would support it. And pretty much the only other thing that was happening was this. So it ended up sounding like this. parts of the States that had records that had that same design, but often in those records you hear the piano all the way up here. But in New Orleans, it's right there in your face. It's like a steamroller. It's great. Oh, it's powerful. So Fats Domino. Well, Blue Monday, how I hate Blue Monday. Yeah, I got to work like a slave all day. Come on Tuesday, dreadful Tuesday. I'm so tired, I got no time to play. Come on Wednesday, I beat to my socks. My baby called, had to tell her that I'm out. Yeah, and Thursday, that's a hard working day. Friday, I get my pay. And everybody plays the triplets on the bridge. Saturday morning, all my time has gone away. I got my money, yeah, I'm up on the stage to play. Sunday morning, my head is bad, but it's worth it for the time that I had. And I got to get my rest, 'cause Monday is a mess. That's the sound we associate with Fats Domino and Smiley Lewis, because Smiley Lewis came before Fats Domino, cut a lot of those tunes, and they couldn't get hits with him, so they just recut them with Fats and went on to make millions of dollars. And Smiley died in poverty, sadly. But Smiley Lewis, really, if you want to hear that style, Smiley Lewis is the cat you should check out. Okay, incredible singer.
Could you talk about Alan Toussaint, who's generally heralded certainly as a songwriter and producer on piano? How would you sort of characterize his contributions there, or all told, however you want to take it?
Alan comes out of the same mold as all the other New Orleans piano players. You know, if you grow up here, you're familiar with second line parades and what the big bass drum does in a funk brass band coming down the street 100 miles an hour. But he was someone who had got some classical training, and his ears were opened up to possibilities fairly early on in his career as a musician. And he, unlike the others, the environment his music developed in was a recording studio. He didn't like doing gigs, particularly earlier on, and elected to not go on the road like all the other musicians did. They had to go on the road to make any money or play. I guess he played gigs locally in New Orleans, but he was acknowledged fairly early on as being somebody who had this rather unique talent in New Orleans, which was disciplining New Orleans musicians in the studio. And the only other guy who'd really done that was Dave Bartholomew in the previous generation. Because getting New Orleans, you know the expression herding cats? That's what it's like trying to organize New Orleans musicians. And it's one thing to get a bunch of New Orleans musicians on a stage. They'll entertain any audience in the world and be the closing show and have everybody second lining and doing all this crazy stuff. That's great on a stage. When you go into a studio and you're making a record, you're doing an entirely different job. You're still using musical instruments. You're still applying a lot of the same rules, but you need a lot more discipline. And you can't make mistakes. You have to be clean. You can't rush 1 minute and start slowing down the tempo the next. You're making a record. You're making a piece of plastic that's got a shelf life of half a century probably. It's going to be listened to by loads and loads of. This is your legacy. You're making a record. It's not a gig. It's a different thing. So you approach it differently. And Alan Toussaint was really good at that. And that's reflected in the way he played piano. He was very accurate. And quite often he was, I would say, and I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, but he would lean more on functionality than the kind of showiness that gets wows when you're playing a gig in front of an audience. You know, a lot of his playing, it just serves the song perfectly. It's almost invisible because it just is one of the cogs of the engine that's whirring away. And if he takes a solo, then you notice it most of the time it's just in the back going. So I don't think he ever really needed to develop the right-hand flair that Booker had or that Mac Rebennack had. And that's not a criticism. It's he was just a great session musician, you know.
Thinking of maybe sort of staying within that realm, I know that Offbeat named you not only the keyboard player of the year, but songwriter of the year, which kudos to you, sir. So I was wondering if maybe you could play a couple of your compositions and talk about how you sort of bring all these elements together.
All right, well, writing songs is not an exact science. And people often ask me questions like, you know, what comes first, the words or the music? And it doesn't, in my experience anyway, it's not as formulaic as that. And so when you write a song, you're basically you're setting out to approach a task which involves imagining something that doesn't exist yet. So that's really the creative part. So usually when I've written songs, the ones the better songs have come out of a result of me just sitting there playing for hours, just making stuff up. And then you hear something that you almost stumble across by accident and go, oh, that sounds pretty hip. I kind of dig that if I heard that on someone's record. So I take the approach, I kind of try and imagine what, if someone came around to my house and said, oh, you got to hear this with a record and then put it on, what would I want to hear coming out of those speakers that would make me go, wow, boy, I really, really like that. So it's a huge jump. You have to kind of imagine something, and then you've got to be prepared to sort of embark on the process and make loads of mistakes and throw most of your ideas away. But one step at a time. And it might start with a hook, like a lyrical idea, or it might start with the introduction, it might start with the outro. There might be just one thing that you get, and you say, right, I've got that, and you get something else. Now you've got two things nailed to the board, and now that could turn into a verse. So you start to see structure come out of a space in the same way as I suppose a sculptor would look at a giant lump of clay and first of all say, well, that could be an elbow, and you gradually start revealing the shape that's already there. And writing lyrics is hard, but you have to be prepared to try out loads of things and proceed on the acceptance that a lot of the ideas you come up with are not going to be very good and are going to be scribbled out. And so you start writing and you start scribbling, and probably after a couple of days you've got something that sounds dreadful and you forget all about it and move on to the next thing. But every once in a while it carries on and you think, man, that actually is pretty good. And so usually when I'm writing, like I say, there's no real method I use it. These things come differently. But I do try and write with a recording device, because I find when you're writing stuff, you have a great idea, and then you have another idea that's probably pretty average, and you scrap that and go back to the great idea, and you've forgotten it. It's gone. So I've forgotten more songs than I've actually written. So I usually try and have some kind of, if I get an idea, I have my phone or I'm in my studio at home, and I'll I'll just start recording stuff, and then you go through, and then you can play freely, and then come back and say, that's good, that idea could work, that might be for another song. And then you have to have some kind of lyrical idea, and quite often the lyrics will suggest a chord progression or chord colorings, and sometimes the other way around. You can play a chord, and that's evocative of something. So yeah.
We'll go.
Well, here's one
All right.
that I've never recorded. And I was kind of thinking about Booker with these chord progressions, but okay. Say you want it your way. Say you want it all. But you can't have it both ways. That's no good to me at all. I'm not your part-time lover. Use and throw away. I leave my love like any other. That's all I'm trying to say. Well, baby, but you wanna have it all. That's no good at all, baby. So on, it carries on like that, but those changes there are some of my favorites. And it's kind of like more sophisticated blues, but that is something I picked up from Mac and from Booker and various. All of them have used it at one time or another. It's just a device, but these changes, you know. I could just stop on that chord and just wait for it to just sort of ring out, and then go to the next one, and the same thing there, really. So if I played the song the way I want to play it, it would take about 3 hours, because I would just play each chord and just go, oh. And then, has to go there. That's one of the things of songwriting or playing, is the way you choose to play a chord, and if you're good, you give the listener, whether they're musicians or not, you give them an intimation of what's coming next. And it's kind of like the same technique they apply when they're writing plays or screenplays or whatever. I think plot development. You kind of sow a seed, and somebody think, oh, did he do it? Or I know what's coming up next. He's going to do that. And when they do, you think, oh, I knew that all along. But if they're really clever, they do something totally different. You think, oh, boy, I didn't see that coming. And that's kind of some of the technique you can employ in music, too. Like there's one song on a recent record I made which went the ending of it was a trick. He goes, and you know where you think it's going to go. You always think it's going to go here. But it doesn't. He goes, So these are old tricks. They've been using these for hundreds of years. Classical composers used all these tricks. Beethoven and Mozart used to mess with all that shit too. So, so the same thing applies when you're writing a song. It's a series of consequential accidents of you just messing around and going, oh, that's good. And, you know, the principle: if you throw enough at the wall, some of it'll stick. So you have to persevere and just keep going. Then you get these ideas you like. But then when you've got the basic song and you're starting to go, okay, I can see the shape in the piece of clay, so now I'm going to start digging in and outlining stuff. At that point, you can start messing with voicings of chords. And as I say, when you play a song or write an arrangement, most of the audience, like the audience here, most of the audience are going to be people who don't play music, who don't spend all day sitting there listening to music and analyzing it. But they do understand. Everyone's heard lots of music. We're surrounded by music, so you understand a lot of the conventions. At least you're familiar with having heard them, even if you don't understand what is being, what devices are being employed. But there is this thing where you create a sense of forward motion by hinting at what's coming up next, or giving the listener a sense of satisfaction by resolving something. And if you can give somebody a sense of satisfaction by resolving something, then you can equally create a sense of disquiet by appearing as though you're about to resolve that in a certain way, and then doing something different. And you're kind of upsetting the cart a little bit. And we're so used to this happening, you don't really think about it. But, you know, when you hear... No, it does. You know what you want to hear. If you put some other chord in there, it's like, that's not right. That's what you want to hear. You've been set up to expect that, and you get it. It's like, thank you. That's good. One thing that's interesting to me is, and that kind of relates to blues, is the way we now process the minor sevenths. Here's a major chord. If you add this note to it, in terms of classical music, that was kind of that was something that was a tool that would be employed to indicate what was coming up next. That addition of that note made this into what they call a dominant chord. A dominant chord wants to give way to a subdominant chord. So you wanted to go. That's called resolution. You've essentially gone from dissonance to consonance. So from good to bad, light, shade to light, whatever, all the metaphors and different ways you can explain that. But you set the ear up to expect something, and then you give it to the ear, and it's a reward, and it makes you feel good. And in the classical music tradition, whenever you had that seventh, you always had to resolve it with that afterwards. And I had a good friend of mine, Jon Porter, who produced all my records. His father loved classical music. And we've become so accustomed to the seventh now that we can end a song on a seventh. We can go... We can end on a seventh. For people for previous generations, that sounds wrong. It's like, you can't end it there, you've got to end it here. See how that has to resolve? And there's stories, Jon Porter, when he was a kid, would come back from a night out and would sit at the family piano downstairs and play a boogie-woogie or a blues or something and end it with... Shut the piano, and he'd go up to bed. And about half an hour later, he'd hear his dad's door open. And he'd come all the way downstairs, slam the piano, and go. Because he'd never be able to get to sleep if that chord wasn't resolved. So that's an interesting how in one generation, the way we hear music has changed. Because we all hear that now is perfect. I mean, we all end all our songs on the seventh. So... Anyway, that's an interesting little aside.
How about, I'm going to open it up for questions, but can you play one more original before we do that?
Yeah. You want to hear anything in particular? Any requests?
Yeah,
Whatever you want. I'm going to write a song called Whatever You Want. Well, whatever you want, baby. You got it, it's yours. If you want it, I got it. If you need it, holler out loud, baby. Whatever you want, oh, honey, it's yours.
Songwriter of the Year.
Song, baby.
So, do people have questions? Yeah.
I'm not aware that it ever did, but I, with all this, I play it. I don't claim to be an expert, or there are like scholars who go and spend hours in libraries looking all this stuff up. There may have been a brilliant, and the musics are very different, but there was never much, as much of a Brazilian influence in New Orleans as there was Spanish or French, certainly. So.
Yep.
I was wondering if your influence from England or Ireland or Scotland, any of that, is in any of the music you play?
Not in the music, really, because most of the pop music from over there is pretty terrible. And I kind of left and had to go halfway around the world to get away from it. But when I was a teenager, before I left and came over here, all my friends were into punk bands. This is the late 70s. I was a bit too young. So the punk thing happened when I was about 14, I suppose. I mean, we used to go, and in England at that time, every time you saw a punk band, and we used to go see all of them whenever we could, because that's what we were all into. But there'd always be a reggae band on the bill. That was the deal. So you'd see The Clash and Aswad, or you'd see The Damned and Matumbi, or one of these English Steel Pulse, or one of these English reggae bands. So there's always reggae around. And then I would go home and I'd sit there going, trying to figure out New Orleans piano riffs. But what was the punk bands pretty much, without exception, as far as I can recall, were useless at playing music. But that was their, if you were proficient at playing music, you were disqualified. Their whole point was to make a horrible noise, but have a lot of attitude, but lots of energy. And I loved their energy of it. And I think if there's anything I took away from that part of my sort of formative growing up years as a musician, it's like when I play, I like to surround myself with musicians who all dig in. And, there's no passengers in the vehicle. Everyone's a cog in the engine, and everybody contributes to the voltage that comes off the stage. And my job as a band leader in my band is to constantly generate energy that kind of, you got to fill up a whole room with energy. You got to fire up, the Maple Leaf Bar or some big outdoor festival where there's thousands of people. So apart from that, I did nothing with English music really, other than English musicians who were looking for the same shit I was. I liked Robert Palmer, and I liked Frankie Miller, a few singers and stuff. Yeah.
Jon, what's the difference between being a band leader and then playing for someone like Bonnie Raitt?
Very big difference, really. And I always made it quite a conscious decision to get as much mileage in each position as I could, because I think it makes you a better band leader if you've been a sideman for somebody else, and vice versa. So as a band leader, I call the shots, and it's good to get ideas, but generally speaking, the musicians are looking to you to say, this is the way we're going. Everyone's got to face in this direction. And it's up to me to adjust things, change things, offer encouragement, and be really strong in delivering the song, because you're up there playing songs, really. And the song is delivered mostly by your voice as the singer, as the front person. So you've got to really handle your business in that department so that everybody else can really do what they do. And I like to use the metaphor of an engine, because it is a bit like an engine. So good musicians will be a functioning part of that engine, and they have the good taste to admit other stuff that they could play, but which might get in the way of one of the other parts. And so it's a very democratic. From the point of view of everyone contributing, it's a democratic kind of thing. From my point of view as a band leader, it's a benign dictatorship. You know, because it's my band, I can say, "Hey man, don't play that, please." All right, cool. You know, or play that's good. Do that again next time. You know. So yeah, it works. Each works to the other's advantage.
Can you give us a glimpse inside how that engine works when musicians are coming together sporadically rather than regularly? So, do you and Ivan play all the time with Bonnie? And how long did you have to rehearse?
Didn't do any rehearsals.
So how does it give us a glimpse as to how it comes off so beautifully without rehearsing together?
Well, every song or every piece of music, if there isn't a lyric or a voice at the front of it, is a sequence of, and forgive me if I'm just stating the obvious, but in order to kind of put it in a context, it's a sequence of chord progressions that sit behind a melody and that form a song which is comprised of verses, choruses, bridges, pre-choruses, interludes, different building blocks that used to make a song. And if you've been doing it for years and years and years, you've played millions of songs that you've heard, and you've figured them out. There's actually not that many songs, really. There's lots of the same things get used over and over again. And you develop a lexicon, a sort of a vocabulary. And you know what the conventions are when those conventions have been broken. And depending on the style of music and the context, if you're good and you've been doing it for years and years and years, then you can pretty much approach a song with another musician, and you know that other musician has the same kind of abstract idea of what's going on as you do, that they have choices and you have choices, and you have to be bold, but you also have to listen to what the other person does and create holes and spaces for them. And that's what really makes New Orleans so special musically, because that's essentially what the first jazz bands did here 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, when they took the music away. They threw the music away and said, we're all just going to improvise. We know how the tune goes, but instead of just playing the melody, instead of playing somebody else's arrangement, we can play that song and have fun with it, and every time we play it, it's going to be different. There are some things that will stay the same, but when you're improvising, you're basically inventing something on the spur of the moment, in a split second, giving due consideration to all the other people that are doing exactly the same thing around you, and you're taking a chance. And based on laws of probability, you will select certain notes to play. And then if you make a mistake, then good musicians will then go and make the same mistake exactly again, louder, like they actually meant to do it. And then, but then you've got to be clever. You tag something on the end of it that makes it actually. Oh, that's I thought he just fucked up, and then he played it again, and it was brilliant. So all those little tricks you have to learn, you know.
Yep.
What was the dynamic like when you first came? It seems like it could have been interesting being from England and coming here and playing New Orleans music. Were the local musicians welcoming from the start, or were there people that were like, what's this guy doing?
Well, as I say, when I came here, I didn't hustle up any gigs for 2 years. I spent 2 years just listening and practicing, because I didn't want that to happen. You know, I felt it'd be enormously disrespectful to the tradition and to the musicians. So I shed it for 2 years here, and accidentally ended up getting gigs covering for Booker occasionally. And then I had to get out of the country because my visa ran out, and I went back to England. I put a band together there for 2 years. And then when I came back, in the interim, Booker had died. So they offered me his old gig at the Maple Leaf on Tuesday nights. And then I got offered Professor Longhair's old Monday night gig at Tipitina's, and then Archibald's old gig on Bourbon Street, and then I landed a gig playing with Sam McLean through a friend of a friend who was a great blues singer. And through that, I met Walter Washington. And Walter hired me to come do the late night gigs at Dorothy's with Johnny Adams. And that's when I started working with Snooks, Eaglin, getting hired to play behind Snooks and Earl King, and Ernie Cader and Jesse Hill and all the other guys from that era, and playing in the band with Smokey Johnson from Fats's band and Irving Charles from Fats's band, or George Porter or Kenneth Blevins, or so. At that point, New Orleans musicians are very nice about that stuff. No one ever said anything. They couldn't care less if you've got a funny accent, if you talk weird. If you can play the right shit on the piano, you just made the gig. So that was cool. So the first time I played with Earl King, when it came to the solo, it was like I went. And you went, how the fuck do you know? Because I used to sit there as a kid and listen to those records of my uncle's house over and over again, so I knew how the piano solo went. So that's how I got hired. But generally, yeah, if you can handle your business, then it's cool. Just don't get up there and try and pretend like you know all about it and don't know what you're doing, because they'll spot that in a minute.
Yep.
I found them. I used to live on Charter Street, and to get home from my gigs on my bicycle, I'd go past the corner of Charters and Frenchman, and there was a joint there where on Sunday nights a gospel band called the Friendly Travellers had a little gig for tips, and I would go in and see them, became friends with them. I just thought they were the best thing. They were great. They sounded like Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions, really. And the guitar player was a young cat, big cat, and the bass player was young. The Friendly Travellers have been going since the 50s. They're like one of these old dynasties where older guys give up and the young relatives come in and take over, So the Friendly Travellers of today is a different band from the original Friendly Travellers. But at this point, the two young cats in the band who were about the same age as me, because I was in my 20s, were Cornell Williams and a guitar player called Derwin Perkins. Who's better known as Big D. And so I'd sit in with them. We got chatting, they invited me to sit in, and they all dug that because they didn't have a keyboard player in the band. And then one year I called them to come play with me at Jazz Festival. Because I would usually use the guys I'd been doing gigs with, like George Porter or Irving Charles. And great, the old session cats, But the one year I thought, but I was doing, when those gigs with the old cats, I use that word advisedly because I'm one of the old cats now. But I was in my 20s and they were all in their 50s. And these guys that grew up in the 50s, I could do a gig with them without any rehearsal. None of them wanted to rehearse. And they just wanted to show up and get paid and do the gig and have some fun, which is cool. So I knew all these old songs that they would have been hits when they were teenagers in New Orleans. So I could play all night long without needing rehearsal. I'd call out these tunes and they would do it. And someone once I said, why don't you write some of your own songs? I always see you covering all these old tunes. You never do anything. Why don't you do some original stuff? And I said, well, I am writing stuff all the time, but I just don't have any money to pay for rehearsals. And I thought, well, I should get a younger band with guys who are real hungry, instead of playing with all the old fuddy-duddies who just want to show up and get paid, which is, like I said, that's completely cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But one time I called Cornell and Big D, and they said, man, what have you been waiting for? We've been waiting for this call for years. Come on, let's do it. Let's get together. And I said, you want to rehearse? I said, I need to, I've got a bunch of songs I want to play. I want to rehearse. They said, cool. And so we did. They came over and we started rehearsing, and no New Orleans bands do that.
One last question. All the way in the back. Yes.
Jon, thank you for being here. I want to talk about the marriage between the left hand and the right hand.
Okay.
Thinking back to any light bulb experiences where everything started to come together.
Playing the piano is a bit like riding a bicycle. If you can ride a bike, you can't understand how anybody would have a problem doing it. If you've never ridden a bike, you're thinking, how on earth does that two wheels just not fall over? And so it's, as a piano player, trying to imagine back when you're learning. This is a bit difficult. It's a bit hard to throw back to that. But if you're playing funk, it's really crucial that the left hand is doing what it does. If you're playing the blues, then the left hand is playing round of an infinite variety of shapes, some of which are more tasteful, some of which don't work at all. Sometimes I think anyway, if I'm playing funk, it's a bit like thinking like a percussionist, like you're playing congas. And you are, because piano is technically a percussion instrument. In an orchestra, a piano is not in the same category as the strings. It's in the same category as the timpani. Because with a piano, you don't pluck a string, you don't bow a string, you hit a hammer. And that hits the string, so it's percussion. So a piano is a percussion instrument, in the same way as congas are a percussion instrument, bongos, timbales. And when you're playing New Orleans funk, you're really playing the percussion, the rhythm. That's what you're basically creating an impression of what a whole band would be doing. And for a lot of people, that's very hard to get the two hands working together, because you really have to think in 8 fingers and 2 thumbs, one great big percussion set of mallets, you know. Other times you can think in terms of a right hand and a left hand. What was your question exactly?
When it finally clicked, was there a moment that it just finally clicked?
Well, with the boogie woogie, it's just through playing it over and over and over again and driving my mum and dad bonkers and everybody else within earshot. And after doing it for several years, when I got to the point where I could suddenly go. See, I'm still messing it up. I'm still trying to figure out how to play that. Boogie woogie, playing how to play a boogie all the way through without clamping. That's a lot of stuff to be doing in your left hand. That, you know. To do that and then all that stuff too. It's kind of nice when you actually when it works. Takes a long time though.
Well, how about this? Can you pull out? You maybe think back to whether it was that Monday night residency or the Tuesday night residency. Maybe just leave us with one song that sort of pulls all that together.
Sure. Just trying to think of something from back then. I wanna jump, but I'm afraid I'll fall. I wanna hide up at the joint too small. Young man, I'm rhythm got a hold on me too. I got the rock and the morning and the boogie woogie flow. Say, baby, won't you hurry on home? I'm getting worried 'cause you're taking too long. But I wanna ball, so what can I do? I got the rock and pneumonia and the boogie woogie flow.
Jon Cleary, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. That was fun.